who are developing assessments or who are focusing in that area. And then you have people like David and Tom who are teaching those teachers who are going to be grading our kids. And, you know, there's a divide, something going on there. And maybe a little bit more looking at that is going to be necessary.
Tom, did you want to add anything?
This conversation makes me yearn for performance assessment. I'm in the world of social studies education as well as teacher education, and there's a whole bunch of outcomes we would want for future citizens that are tough to measure. And I understand it's possible but difficult. You'd like future citizens to think critically and read critically. You'd like them to be inclined to look for multiple perspectives, to have both the ability and the disposition to desire to see issues from multiple sides. You'd like them to be comfortable working with controversial issues. And to the extent that we put pressure and emphasis on assessment elsewhere, which is not, this is now what policy, I'd say more than making the test, we privilege some outcomes at the expense of anything I would list that sounds like the kind of features that often social studies people value in a citizen, the active citizenship, the critical citizenship. Deborah Meyer was a much beloved principal of Central Park East, one of these typical urban schools that, given the sociodemographic features of the students that went there, students did beautifully in terms of both some traditional assessments and going to college. But she lined up a bunch of outcomes and said, instead of grading or testing, what we're going to do is have performance assessments where students have to produce the project. They do the science experiment and present it to a committee of parents, students, and teachers. And there's actually no grade, but there's a kind of, it's just pass-fail. But there's an amount of dialogue and feedback that gets very richly at multiple outcomes. Scaling that up, I know Vermont tried to have its own very modest version of a portfolio of data this kind of work. And scaling that up is very difficult because it's so expensive. But I think in education, since the time of Thorndike, one of the first educational researchers in the 20s, we've been grappling with this challenge of it's easy and cheap to measure certain things. And this is in part, I think, a resource limitation. So I think my hope would be local schools at some point have to make the decision to commit to rich outcomes and rich assessments that let multiple stakeholders get the kind of rich feedback and multiple outcomes that you would suggest.
Thank you. Is there a question from the audience that's not on testing?
My question is a completely different angle this time. This question basically is, fairness to be means fairness for all, but there's a very thin line distinction between fairness and equality. I'm saying, how would you explain how you draw a line between having fairness for all, and on the other hand, making things equal, which sometimes changes the spectrum there, having equality for all genders, races, EL, non-ELO, and different groups. But sometimes like, you change the straight in order to increase equality, that goes against fairness. So how do you balance both things and make it fairness for all, sometimes create different cut points or different criteria for different groups?
That legitimately thorny and difficult question for policy. I know in the state of Connecticut, we around English language learners or emerging bilinguals, if you want a less deficit-oriented word, around students who have not mastered English sufficiently that they could succeed in a mainstream classroom without some special supports. We simply have a law that says we expect there to be additional training or resources. We expect that there'll be additional, whether it's human personnel or training, resources will be given above and beyond in a way that doesn't sound equal to ensure that there's equal access or equal opportunity. So there's still a fuzzy line. I don't think I've tackled the fullness of your question, but that seems like a reasonable kind of line to set, to try and ask what's required to get all students access to the music room. If it's an elevator, if it's a teacher who has training for linguistic, cultural difference, whatever it is, then that's one way to answer that, which means equal's not the aim at all.
Right. Tom, could I ask you to, it sounds to me like we're talking about the difference between equality and equity. So with your cookie example, you know, if I'm full and I've just had 12 cookies and this, you know, my big brawny brother hasn't had any cookies today, maybe he should get a bigger piece of the cookie because his belly's bigger. But it's about equity. So the ELLs, or the emergent bilinguals, I love that term, they need additional resources, which in a vacuum, and this goes back to context, I think, in a vacuum, it may seem like additional resources is not fair or equal, but it's equitable.
Yes. Hi, I'm Kevin Krause from Rutgers University, and in talking about fairness, we've talked a lot about assessment and opportunity, but I think when we look at like some of the empirical work, there's like another thread that kind of stands out, and I think one of the most intuitive arguments I've heard is that students who get into Harvard and Princeton don't graduate at 95, 96% rates because they're just intuitively or innately smart, but because those schools have immense support systems to make sure they don't drop out in comparison to the larger state schools where some New Jersey schools, they have trouble just getting out. That students are on probation. And so I'm wondering how you see kind of support be working into fairness and aside from just saying, well, support's really important, in the current policy environment, where do you see the possibility for support systems being put into place that will increase fairness?
How long is this session?
5 more minutes.
Yeah, support's important. Thank you. Good question. Priorities, I think, will dictate supports, and priorities vary. Priorities will allocate resources, and I'll go back to my sort of opening comment that the context matters, and I do think that Kristen's succinct and I think appropriate differentiation between equal and equity also relates to that notion. And so I could easily imagine contexts where supports are offered in ways that, again, to borrow a phrase, in a vacuum seem completely out of sync, but fairness, in my notion, because of equity, demands that we set those priorities and resources. And I think within the broader system of education, we're okay in some areas. I think laws dictate some of that. But I've lived in states where schools are funded entirely town by town, which of course set property values and real estate taxes, and I think you all know the argument. And yet there seems to be a lot of talk, a little movement to support this notion that funding could be allocated differently. So there's got to be some will, some political muscle. And again, not to point the finger at you, I'm pointing the finger at all of us. What's the role of an organization like NERA? There are many times over the year, we come into these thorny issues and I think, boy, I know a lot of smart people who go to Rocky Hill every October who would have a lot to say. And it seems as an organization, we could be more value added in throwing our weight behind some of these. There's a lot of brain power in the room and thousands of years of professional experience if you would add it all up, for sure. And I think we have a lot to say about those priorities and those supports. And I'm looking for ways that as an organization we can do more of that.
Anyone else want to respond to another question? Yeah.
Hi, Kelsey. Hi. Oh, okay. There we go. Hi, I'm Kelsey. Oh my gosh. Hi, I'm Kelsey. I am a teacher in Boston, and I'm a recent graduate from University of Connecticut. My question kind of posed to all of you guys. So we're a room full of mostly researchers. As researchers who aren't directly in the trenches, I love that term, and interacting with students every single day, how can we directly impact fairness and promote it in education? Actually, in that classroom.
Dialogue. Dialogue with your colleagues. I mean, this is what David's talking about. I mean, we get into a safe place like this room, like this conference, and we are willing to speak about the nuances and the complexities, and we get out there in the trenches or in the public space, and to often what I witness every day is adults behaving like children in terms of politicizing and oversimplifying issues in order to appease special interests. As researchers, as scholars, we should not do that ever.
Ongoing deep partnership between researchers and teachers and schools in a way that positions researchers as co-learners, because we're always at risk of being the experts and big brother and no one answer. But I think researchers ought to have some background knowledge and theory that would help those right in the trenches, and those right in the trenches know and live and see things that researchers need to understand and hear. Deep partnership.
Darlene, or whoever idea was to put this session together, thank you very much. This was great. It's been really hard for me not to answer these questions. It's not my role, but it's killing me. But rather than take another question or put the microphone back to the panel, I'm going to extend an invitation to everyone. And the invitation is not to corner the panel members and to talk to them about your burning issues, but to engage each other. Because this session has brought up a lot of beginnings of conversations. For every question that was asked, there's 3 or 4 more, and there's many more answers. So what I'd like you to do is, lunch is going to start soon, right? Start to talk to each other about these issues. Start to collaborate on some proposals for NERA next year and elsewhere so that we can really make some progress. And not just talk to each other, but as the last question posed points out, how do we really make this happen and become effective so we can promote fairness in the classroom and elsewhere? And then, Darlene, there you are. Go ahead.
Can I ask a question just of David? When are you going to share your cookie with us?
He ate it. He ate it.
You can't snack on PowerPoints.
Sometimes life is not always fair, though. But you do get 2 free drink tickets with your NERA membership. Everyone got 2, right?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Let's hear it from the panel.